Let me tell you about the most effective vendor management I have ever experienced. I have to go back almost 40 years to my days in the computer repair industry. Our company provided computer repair services. One of our clients was the American Airlines Sabre system, the part of American Airlines that provided travel agents with an online flight booking system. Now, this was back in the 1980s, before internet, before World Wide Web, or even before 286 processor in a personal computer. But that's another story for another time. I worked for one of the largest computer repair companies in Canada. We had other clients in the travel industry, and the travel industry was one of the smaller components of our client base. But American Airlines Sabre system managed us differently than any other customer. In this video, I'll be taking lessons I learned about vendor management from the Sabre system, as well as lessons I have learned from over 40 years of being a vendor, having vendors, and having customers with vendors. But this is just not a video of vendor management stories. I want to distill those stories into a list of vendor management best practices. Welcome back to this series, Staying Between the Lines, Compliance and Vendor Management. In the first 3 videos of this playlist, I covered the role of the compliance team. Starting on video 4, the last video, our discussion moved to vendor management as I talked about who are my vendors. Have you made the business process flow map I talked about in that video? If so, you have the tool to make an accurate list of your vendors. In this video, we'll add vendor management strategies you can apply to the entities in your vendor list. Like a 9-year-old. Okay, let me frame that explosive statement. I spent the first 12 years of my IT career working for various vendors. Over those years, we had hundreds of clients, people who needed to manage us as we provided products and services to them. American Airlines Sabre system was one of those clients. They stood out from the rest of the customer base. Other customers got whatever technician was available. Sabre had dedicated service technicians. During a snow blizzard, other customers got best effort arrival. Sabre still had a guaranteed mean time to arrive. Our company had a pool of parts to service all our customers, except for Sabre. We had a separate inventory of spare parts just for the Sabre account. How did they get that level of service? Why were every one of our competitors fighting to steal the Sabre account from us? Yes, they were big, but they weren't the biggest client. They were the best at managing their vendors. There was no mystery in that account. You always knew where you stood, how well you were doing, and what profitability you were getting from that contract. They managed us like a 9-year-old. Okay, I really like 9-year-olds. They come with different skills and levels of responsibility. They have enough tenure and experience to be great companions on a journey and really good partners in projects. Their world is shaped more by the literal and tactical than by the abstract and strategic, so they can be a refreshing break from adults. The only caveat in working with 9-year-olds is that you, as the adult, need to own the responsibility while they capably do the roles and tasks. Managing vendors is the same, and here are some solid, justifiable reasons why. Who owns your business? Who owns their business? Well, who owns your business? You do. Okay, I know, unless you're a one-person business like I am, you probably work for a corporation that has an executive team, a board of directors, and stockholders. But I'm not getting into a philosophical discussion of ownership models. You own your business. Whether you are a business owner, executive, mid-level manager, an experienced team member, or a new hire, you are the one responsible for the fulfillment of your role as it feeds into the corporate goals and accomplishments. Who owns their business? Every employee of theirs owns their business. The representatives from your vendors who support your company work for their employers. You are not their employer. They are responsible to fulfill the goals, metrics, and ambitions of their employer, just like you are responsible to your employer. Delegate roles and tasks. Never delegate responsibility. Responsibility, that is the key word. Whether or not you actually do all the tasks that cause your responsibility to be accomplished, you are the one who makes sure the responsibility is fulfilled. In my last video, I discussed the difference between an employee, a contractor, and a vendor. Only the employee is responsible to just one employer. Contractors and vendors have divided loyalties to you and to their employer. They are distracted. Ultimately, they are responsible to their employer to fulfill their employer's goals and ambitions. The tasks and roles they fulfill for you and your company will be done through the filter of their responsibility to their employer. And that is exactly what they should be doing. Therefore, you should never delegate responsibilities. Only delegate tasks and roles to vendors and contractors. Responsibility needs to stay in-house. That was one of the things that made Sabre Systems so effective. They had a team of employees who were responsible to see that all the vendors performed to their contracted roles and tasks. That team would meet with our company's senior management each month to review service calls, response times, repair time, parts management, and every other performance item that was part of the contract with them. That Sabre System team was responsible to make sure we completed everything well. I remember once, just once, I accidentally took a Sabre part for another customer service call. Oh boy, did I get in trouble. There was no place to hide the error. It had to be reported to the Sabre System team in the next monthly meeting. This brings up a very pertinent point. What is the line between vendor accountability and micromanaging a vendor? The opposite question is equally valid. What does non-managing a vendor look like? I don't know if there's a conclusive answer to that question. Like 9-year-olds, vendors have varying degrees of maturity, focus, and distraction. Therefore, skills and principles will provide us with better guidance than pat answers as we interact with our vendors. Let's take a look at 7 critically important vendor management skills. For each skill, I will give you a definition for the skill. Then I will compare vendor non-management, vendor micromanagement, and quality vendor management perspectives on this skill. Here we go. The first skill I want to talk about is respect. Respect your vendors. Without respect as a foundation, any relationship will go toxic. I have seen many companies and their vendors become increasingly dysfunctional because of a lack of mutual respect. You, like I, have probably heard the hall talk from the vendor non-management team. I had to hire this vendor for Department X, but they are idiots. I don't care what they are doing. This hands-off expression of disrespect creates a black hole where communication between the vendor management team and the vendor become less frequent, less interactive, until eventually there's no communication at all. You can't manage without communicating. You can't communicate effectively without respect. For the vendor micromanagement team, that same disrespect is expressed with the same starting phrase. I had to hire this vendor for Department X. However, their reaction to their mistrust is to meddle in every detail of that vendor's interaction with the company. This creates an annoying noise of second-guessing and needless challenging of the vendor. Not because the vendor is incapable, but because the vendor is not respected. The angst created by that noise will either drive the vendor to retaliate against the company, which is not a good move, or the vendor will minimize any interaction with the company to avoid the constant demeaning noise. So, what does respect look like in managing a vendor? Respect begins with honoring a vendor's reputation in the marketplace. You hired them because they have a good product or service. Respect between you and your vendor grows as your vendor management team excels at the vendor management skills we will cover in this list. Constructive communication is one of the most effective expressions of respect. Even in a conflict with a vendor, never sacrifice respect. The second skill is understand your vendors. This skill not only makes you much more effective at vendor management, it will also increase your respect for your vendors. Ask them questions. Learn their systems. Learn their organization structure and their company culture. Become fluent in their industry and corporate dialect. Find out all you can about their goals and ambitions. I can hear the vendor non-management team saying, "How they do that is their problem. I have enough on my plate without having to learn their processes and systems." The problem with that stance is that without understanding your vendor, you cannot represent them well to your company, nor can you represent your company to them. How can you manage something you don't understand? The vendor micromanagement team says, "I don't have that problem. I'm constantly telling my vendor how to fulfill the roles I gave them." Yeah, that is disrespectful, isn't it? If I'm constantly forcing my vendors to do things my way, then I don't have any understanding of how they do what they do. I'm creating a constant destructive tornado for them and for my company. Why even have a vendor if I'm going to dictate every detail of what they do? Whether in vendor management or account management, and there are a lot of similarities between those two roles, I've always tried to learn as much as possible about my vendors and my customers. I remember being in a meeting with senior technical people from a customer and our company's senior technical team. The customer was at one end of the table, and our company team was at the other end of the table. For some reason, I sat in the middle between them and them and them. The meeting was not going well. People were getting frustrated. I knew this customer, their culture, their systems, and their dialect very well. I also knew our own company's culture, systems, and dialect very well. More about that last point in just a few minutes. I realized there was a dialect issue happening. Words said by our company meant something different to the customer. Yes, companies have their own dialects. So, in my role as liaison, I began to translate between the two groups. Between one group and the other group, and then from that group, back to that group. As I did so, the tension in the air eased. The meeting room ambiance relaxed. The meeting became very constructive and profitable because I understood their company. This leads to the third skill. Understand your end users. Unfortunately, many vendor management teams miss this perspective. I've heard many vendor non-management teams say things like, "Hey, if they don't like the service or product, talk to my boss. I'm not paid to figure out other people's problems." Here's a basic question. How can I effectively manage my vendors if I don't understand how or why people in my company are using the products or services from those vendors? Unfortunately, I've seen the other extreme from the vendor micromanagement team. "I have initiated 4 complaints to management about teams paying for services they don't use the way I think they should." Wait a minute. Why is your relationship with the end user teams in your company so toxic that you have to flag their behavior to management? Vendor management sits in a key position. However, like all key positions, it's not a solo act. I used a word a minute ago, liaison. A liaison is a person who links different people or groups together. A liaison understands both groups and is able to create a constructive conversation, bridging the differences between culture, language, and roles of the different groups. Vendor management is a liaison role. I don't do the end user's job. I rely on them to let me know what works and what things are pain points. If I know the end user's world and I know the vendor's world, then I can effectively bridge between the two groups to make my company more effective at what it does. Skill number 4, contract. A well-written contract is worth its weight in gold. I have seen hundreds of companies and vendors get into relationship squabbles, legal battles, and media wars just because their contract did not capture the critical points of the relationship. These critical points are: what does the vendor need to do? What does my company need to do? How will that be measured? What is the payment structure, and how is that payment structure affected by behavior that doesn't align with the contract? And number 5, what are the ways the contract can be amended or nullified? A quality vendor management team knows the contract with each vendor. They have metrics in place to measure performance against the contract. They have protocol in place to identify any behavior or needs that fall outside of the contract and can quickly escalate these so that the behavior can be addressed or the contract can be amended. The vendor micromanagement team says, "The contract was written by people who don't understand the business like I do. If I see gaps, I put extra requirements on the vendor, whether or not they are part of the contract." This places the company at legal risk from the demands against the vendor for services, products, or favors that are not contained in the contract. On the other hand, the vendor non-management team is even worse. They say, Contracts are for lawyers to look at. Why even have a contract if vendor management does not know the contract details and does not monitor the contract compliance? Vendors, like a 9-year-old, know when you're not watching the contract. Inevitably, they will underperform against the contract. It's not a malicious sabotage of your company. Service providing has very thin profit margins. If a customer doesn't seem to want the full contracted service, it's less expensive to give them less service. Now, that can sound demeaning to vendors, but it's not my intention at all. I have worked for service providers. We were working under 100 different contracts. The only contracts we knew to the letter were for the customers who tracked performance against the contractual agreement, like American Airlines Sabre system. This leads directly to the next skill, accountability. Believe it or not, vendors like accountability if it is done well. The vendor non-management team, remember the quote I used to start my last video? "I hire responsible vendors, I don't need to manage them." 2 years later, that company was out of business. Accountability would have saved them. The vendor micromanagement team implements accountability requirements that exceed the contract agreements. Once again, this not only demonstrates disrespect for the vendor, it places your company on shaky legal ground. I have seen these teams demand detailed custom reporting. This not only places inordinate strain on the vendor, it also prevents the vendor management team from being able to gather market-level competitive information to compare how their vendor is performing. A quality vendor management team will implement an accountability reporting and meeting cadence that matches contract requirements and the reporting abilities of the vendor. As much as possible, this team uses vendor standard reporting for audit and accountability purposes. This not only makes it smoother accountability relationship, it allows the vendor to provide benchmark reporting as well, if that benchmark reporting is in the contract. Skill number 6, compliance. We can't talk about payments industry without talking about compliance. Remember in the second video of this series, I let you know where your vendors touch your business, you are responsible to the payment networks and to the government authorities for your vendors being in compliant with their requirements. If your vendors aren't compliant where they touch your business, you are in trouble with the network or the government, not them. I've seen far too many vendor non-management teams who simply forward the compliance bulletins to their vendors and let the vendors figure out what they will do with it. Please go back and watch my videos, Herding Cats, Semi-Annual Release Management, and my video, Monthly Bulletins, Who Cares?, to find out why this vendor management strategy is dangerous to your company's compliance and its strategic direction. The vendor micromanagement team? I tell the vendors exactly how to implement each compliance requirement based on my understanding of what they need to do. And with that attitude and strategy, this team breaks respect for their vendor, fails to understand their vendor, invalidates any vendor accountability, and probably violates the contract with the vendor if that contract is well written. So, how should I handle compliance with my vendors? I need to be fully aware of my company's compliance requirements, strategically and tactically. I communicate these requirements to the affected vendors. Remember, I understand their culture, systems, processes, and dialects. I actively track their progress in conforming to the compliance requirements. This brings us to the last skill on my list. Vendor management teams have an amazing opportunity to curate best practices. As a vendor management team, you get to watch many companies and departments do their thing. You will see those who do very poorly, those who are managing along, and a few who are amazing. You will also be privy to a lot of confidential information and processes. This is where you need to be very careful. Confidential information is very useful to you in your role. However, it may be a patented process or some secret sauce that gives one company an edge over its competitors. This confidential information cannot be shared with other teams or companies. That would be a violation of your position of trust with the teams and vendors you work with. However, there are best practices you will encounter that can be shared with other teams and vendors. Your company may adopt some of these best practices as contractual terms going forward. Other best practices can help you help a vendor who is good but struggling in an area. Not everyone wants to be a curator of best practices. Someone from the vendor non-management team is likely to say, "How vendors do their thing is their business. As long as work gets done, why should I care about how they do it?" Meanwhile, the vendor micromanagement team is so busy imposing their own ideas and practices on vendors and other departments, they would never think to look to find someone who could do things better than they are. But what about you and your vendor management team? Which team are you? The vendor non-management team? The vendor micromanagement team? Or do you want to take up the challenge to be one of the few quality vendor management teams? If you do want to be better at vendor management, contact me. I can help you get there. As you can see, effective vendor management is based on a solid contract that defines roles and responsibilities, metrics that are reportable and provide meaningful measure of vendor effectiveness, and good interactive relationships between the vendor and the end users through the vendor management team. Almost all the time, a well-managed vendor performs well. A well-run vendor management team and program give your company and your vendors a firm foundation to build a constructive partnership that transcends traditional supplier-customer relationships. Well-written contracts are like good fences that make good neighbors. You know what you need to do, you know what they need to do, you both know how that will be measured. There is certainty in the relationship. There will be a few times when, in spite of top-level vendor management, a service provider just doesn't provide the service, and a supplier doesn't supply a product. What do you do then? We'll cover that in my next video. If you found this video helpful, please click the like button and subscribe to this channel. If you have more questions about the payments industry, leave a message in the comments below. You can also contact me through my website, mentoredbymarkt.com, or via email, markt@mentoredbymarkt.com.